What if I told you that the way you think, your ability to express ideas, make sense of the world, and even understand yourself, is shaped not by some universal truth, but by the very structure of language itself? Ludwig Wittgenstein, one of the most enigmatic and revolutionary philosophers of the 20th century, believed that philosophy's greatest errors stemmed from our misunderstandings of language. He didn't just ask what words mean. He questioned how meaning itself is formed. And in doing so, he reshaped the entire course of modern philosophy. To understand Wittgenstein's philosophy, we first need to understand the man himself, because few philosophers lived as intensely or as restlessly as he did. So let's find out who Wittgenstein was and explore his ideas. Born in 1889 into one of the wealthiest families in Vienna, Ludwig Wittgenstein grew up surrounded by culture, intellect, and extreme pressure to succeed. His father, Karl Wittgenstein, was a powerful steel magnate who demanded excellence from his children. The Wittgenstein household was frequented by some of the greatest minds of the time. Composers like Gustav Mahler and Johannes Brahms were regular visitors. Yet despite this privileged upbringing, Ludwig's life would be marked by deep inner turmoil, radical transformations, and an obsessive dedication to philosophy. Initially, Wittgenstein didn't set out to become a philosopher. He studied engineering in Berlin before moving to Manchester to work on aeronautics. It was there that he became fascinated with logic, particularly the work of Gottlob Frege and Bertrand Russell. This interest quickly consumed him. In 1911, he travelled to Cambridge to study under Russell, who was immediately struck by Wittgenstein's intensity. Within a few years, Russell declared that Wittgenstein was a genius, someone who might well surpass all of his predecessors in logic. But Wittgenstein's philosophical pursuits were interrupted by World War I. Unlike many intellectuals of his time, he didn't avoid the conflict. Instead, he enlisted voluntarily in the Austro-Hungarian army, even requesting to be sent to the front lines. He carried a copy of Tolstoy's Gospel in Brief with him, and during this period, he underwent a profound spiritual transformation. It was in the trenches that he developed the core ideas of Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, the book that would make him famous. He believed he had solved all of philosophy's problems, and with that, walked away from academia. Giving away his inherited fortune and retreating into an austere, solitary life. For years, Wittgenstein lived in near isolation, working as a schoolteacher in rural Austria. His strict and unconventional teaching methods made him both respected and feared by his students. But his dissatisfaction with philosophy never fully disappeared. In 1929, he unexpectedly returned to Cambridge, not as a student, but as a lecturer. And over the next 2 decades, his views underwent a dramatic shift. The logical, rigid structure of Tractatus gave way to the more fluid, dynamic concepts of philosophical investigations. His later years were spent refining these ideas, often in solitude. He travelled frequently, seeking quiet places to think, whether in a remote Norwegian cabin or a small cottage in Ireland. He never married, had little interest in material wealth, and remained enigmatic even to his closest friends. By the time he died of cancer in 1951, he had left behind not just a revolution in philosophy, but a personal legacy as one of the most uncompromising, restless thinkers of the modern age. Wittgenstein's life was one of extremes: intellectual brilliance, personal asceticism, and radical self-reinvention. And as we will see, his philosophy mirrors this same relentless search for clarity, constantly challenging and reshaping itself over time. Wittgenstein's early work was driven by a singular, audacious goal: to define the precise limits of what can be meaningfully said. He believed that language, when properly analysed, could reveal the structure of reality itself, and that everything outside these limits, including ethics, metaphysics, and even philosophy itself, belonged to the realm of the unsayable, This vision culminated in his first and only published book during his lifetime, Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, 1921. Written largely while serving as a soldier during World War I, the Tractatus is a dense and enigmatic work, structured as a series of numbered propositions, each building upon the last. It opens with one of the most famous statements in modern philosophy. The world is everything that is the case. For Wittgenstein, the world consists of facts, things that are the case, rather than objects or substances. And these facts can only be meaningfully represented through language, which he saw as a kind of logical picture of reality. At the heart of the Tractatus is what has come to be known as the picture theory of language. According to this view, language works by mirroring the logical structure of the world. Words correspond to objects. Sentences correspond to states of affairs. And when we use language correctly, we create accurate pictures of reality. But this also means that anything which cannot be pictured in this way, such as ethics, aesthetics, or the meaning of life, falls outside the realm of meaningful discourse. This leads to perhaps the most radical claim of the Tractatus: whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. Wittgenstein saw this as the solution to many traditional philosophical problems. Questions about metaphysics, the soul, or the nature of the good life were, in his view, not problems to be solved, but misuses of language. Philosophy's task was not to provide answers to these questions, but to reveal them as meaningless from a linguistic standpoint. It was this aspect of the Tractatus that resonated most with the Vienna Circle, a group of early 20th century philosophers who developed logical positivism, a movement that sought to eliminate metaphysical speculation and ground all knowledge in empirical science and formal logic. They interpreted Wittgenstein as arguing that meaningful statements must be either empirically verifiable or logically necessary. Everything else, including much of traditional philosophy, was dismissed as nonsensical. Wittgenstein truly believed that he had solved philosophy. With the completion of the Tractatus, he saw no reason to continue the discipline and walked away, as stated previously, giving away his inheritance and living in near solitude. When Ludwig Wittgenstein returned to philosophy in the late 1920s, he began dismantling the very framework he had constructed in the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. As mentioned earlier, he had once believed that language functioned as a rigid logical structure, mirroring the world through clear, definable propositions. But over time, he came to see this view as deeply flawed. Instead, in his later masterpiece, Philosophical Investigations, Wittgenstein introduced a radically different way of thinking about language. One that rejected the idea that words derive meaning from a fixed logical structure. Rather than words being bound by a singular underlying essence, he argued that meaning is shaped by use, by the specific context in which words are spoken and understood. This shift gave rise to one of his most influential ideas: language games. To Wittgenstein, language is not a single unified system governed by rigid logical rules. Instead, it consists of many different language games, each with its own internal logic and purpose. A language game is essentially any form of communication that operates according to specific, often implicit rules. Consider the ways we use language in everyday life: making a promise, asking a question, giving an order, telling a joke, describing a feeling, conducting a scientific experiment. Each of these is its own language game with its own rules of meaning. The way words function in one context may not apply in another. When a scientist says, "This is true," they mean something different than when a poet, a politician, or a child says the same phrase. Another example of Wittgenstein's language games is the difference between legal discourse and moral reasoning. Consider the phrase, "That action was wrong." In a courtroom, this belongs to the legal language game, where wrongdoing is defined by laws and evidence. A lawyer would ask, "Does this action violate a statute?" If a friend says, "That action was wrong," they are not necessarily referring to a legal violation, but rather expressing a personal or cultural judgment based on ethical intuition, emotions, or social norms. The mistake, from Wittgenstein's perspective, would be to assume that these two language games must operate by the same rules. Crucially, Wittgenstein argued that meaning is not something that exists independently of these contexts. It emerges through use. In other words, there is no single ultimate essence of a word like truth, justice, or love. Their meanings depend on the language games they are part of. This was a profound departure from his earlier belief that language had a fixed logical structure. Instead of seeking a grand unified theory of meaning, he encouraged us to look at how words are actually used in practice. Another key insight from philosophical investigations is Wittgenstein's private language argument, which challenges the idea that we can have a language that is purely private, one that only an individual could understand. Imagine trying to create a language to describe your own internal sensations, such as pain. If you were the only person who ever used and understood this language, how would you know you were using words correctly? Wittgenstein argued that language requires a shared framework, a set of social rules that allow us to communicate and verify meaning. This idea had profound implications for philosophy. It suggested that our thoughts and even our self-understanding are not purely private affairs. They are shaped by the languages we inherit from our communities. Wittgenstein's ideas have significantly influenced political and social thought, particularly in discussions on discourse and power, despite his lack of direct engagement with political philosophy. His work anticipated themes later developed by thinkers like Michel Foucault, particularly the idea that language shapes reality. If meaning is determined by use, then those who control discourse effectively control how reality is perceived, a concept central to critiques of propaganda, media manipulation, and political rhetoric. Furthermore, Wittgenstein's notion of language games helps explain the limits of debate in public discourse. Political debates often feel like they are talking past each other. They may use the same words while operating within entirely different conceptual frameworks, leading to miscommunication and seemingly irresolvable conflicts. Wittgenstein's philosophy does not end with a grand conclusion. It leaves us with an awareness of how fragile and contingent our understanding of the world really is. His work reminds us that meaning is not something we uncover, but something we create, constantly, through our participation in language. So the next time you find yourself in a debate, a disagreement, or simply struggling to put your thoughts into words, ask yourself, are we speaking the same language? Or are we just playing different games? Perhaps the task of philosophy is not to find absolute truths, but to recognize the invisible structures of meaning that shape our thoughts, and in doing so, to navigate them more carefully. Thank you very much for watching, and don't forget to subscribe. Hit the thumbs up button and share your thoughts in the comments below.